Hello students. In my previous video, we looked at an outline of Solomon Asch's conformity study, where participants had to give verbal statements whilst under a bit of psychological pressure to conform to group opinion. Now, if you haven't watched that yet, or you're unfamiliar with the basic outline, I suggest you do that before going on with this one, which is an evaluation. I'm going to start with some weaknesses. A major limitation is that Asch's setup wasn't natural. What does that mean? Just that the participants knew they were in a research study, and because of this, they may have simply gone along with what they thought was expected. That's a phenomenon we call demand characteristics. The task itself, identifying lines, was also quite trivial, and by that I mean there were no real consequences for being wrong. So why not just conform? Furthermore, as social psychologist Susan Fiske pointed out in 2014, Asch's groups weren't very groupy. That is, they consisted of a line of seated Confederates and the participant. So they didn't resemble the real complex groups we experience in everyday life. And as a result, the findings might not generalize to real-world situations, especially those where the consequences of conformity are actually important. Here's an illustration. In my first video on this topic, I spoke about a new student in a school being pressured to conform by accepting a dare to shoplift. The consequence for not accepting that dare would be exclusion from the group. And that's a big deal for a teenager trying to fit in at a new school. Compare that consequence with the one facing a participant in Asch's experiment. The worst that could happen is that he'd feel a bit awkward in front of a group of people he didn't even know and would probably never see again. Next, we have the issue of limited application. That is, the study lacked generalizability because the participants were all white male American college students. So this was a very narrow and culturally homogeneous group. What about older adults, different ethnic groups, and people in collectivist cultures where conformity rates might be higher? And what about women? In 1995, Felix Neto, a Portuguese social psychologist, conducted a replication of Asch's line judgment task, but this time using women as participants. They were Portuguese female students about the same age and educational level as Asch's participants. What do you think he found? If you're in a classroom situation, you may want to pause the video here and have a quick discussion about whether you think the results would have been the same or different, and if different, in which direction and why. So, what were the findings? In Asch's original study, about 74% of men conformed at least once, and around 32% conformed on the majority of critical trials. Remember, when we talk about critical trials, we mean the ones where the Confederates gave the wrong answers. In Neto's female sample, 59% of women conformed at least once, and about 28% conformed on 3 or more critical trials. So let's compare those figures. For conformed at least once, that's a 15% drop in Neto's study compared to Asch's. And for frequent conformity, the difference is much smaller, only 4% lower for the women. So what does that tell us? Well, while the numbers are not identical, the pattern of conformity is quite similar across men and women in those two studies. And this suggests that Asch's basic finding that many people will conform to group pressure even when the answer is obviously wrong is not just a male phenomenon. However, because both studies were carried out in Western individualistic societies, we still need to be careful about assuming that these findings apply to all cultures. And then Asch's and Neto's studies were done about 40 years apart and in different countries. could the variations between these circumstances have made a difference? Now I want to go back 15 years from Netto to Perrin and Spencer's 1980 study, which was also a replication of Asch's experiment, but in the UK. Their participants were engineering, mathematics, and chemistry university students in 396 critical trials. That's a really good sample. Perrin and Spencer recorded only one instance of conformity, and this near total lack of conformity stood in dramatic contrast to Asch's conformity rate. They concluded that the Asch effect is not a stable feature of human behavior, but depends heavily on the social and historical context. They suggested three main reasons. First, the nature of the participants. The engineering, maths, and science students were highly analytical, confident in dealing with precise answers, and thus more resistant to group pressure. And second, cultural and historical change. The 1980s in the UK placed greater emphasis on individualism and skepticism of authority than the conformist 1950s. And third, the carryover effect, which is that participants may have suspected the Confederates were following some hidden rule or trick rather than believing they were genuinely mistaken. However, critics note that Perrin and Spencer's study, as we've mentioned a moment ago, lacked population validity, as it only tested engineering, maths, and science students. Just to mention here that population validity is a special type of generalizability. It refers to the extent to which the findings of a study can be applied to people beyond the sample that was studied. In other words, does the sample accurately represent the wider population in terms of age, gender, culture, background, and so on? In fact, in a separate variation of their study, Perrin and Spencer also tested 4 young male criminal offenders. Only 4? Well, with a small sample like that, you'd immediately argue for a lack of population validity. But in the context of Asch's study and that of Netto some years later, the results are interesting. When each offender participated in the trial, he sat next to his probation officer, who was primed to give the same wrong answers as the Confederates. So essentially, the probation officers were also Confederates. And before giving his answer, the offender would hear his probation officer go along with the other's wrong answer. How's that for pressure? I mean, you're young, you've been in trouble with the law, and now, to be correct, you not only have to disagree with the other people in the room, but one of them is your probation officer. That's someone with real authority who controls your future. Well, as you can imagine, conformity was high. In fact, the mean conformity was 3.25 out of 12. They also did the study with unemployed young men from the Caribbean in Britain and found the same mean conformity rate of 3.25 out of 12. So both these groups were similar to Asch's findings. Another replication study done by Nicholson et al. In 1985 compared 38 white male UK students and 21 white US students in groups of 3 Confederates to 1 participant on 12 trials. And the results were compared with Asch's combined data from 3 versions of his experiment in 1951, 52, and 56. And that's a total of 123 participants. As you can see from the table, the mean rate of conformity out of 12 for Asch's combined experiments was 4.41, so about a third. And then 30 years later, the conformity with UK male students was quite a bit less than 1 out of 12, a big drop. The US students in the same year also showed much less conformity at lower than 2 out of 12, but still quite a lot higher than the UK students. Interestingly, though, 68% of UK students and 62% of US students never conformed at all. And that's very similar to one another. So it seems that by the 1980s, young American men were a lot more independent in their thinking than back in the 1950s. We don't know about UK men in the 1950s because the study wasn't done with them. Now let's take a look at some data from a meta-analysis done by Smith and Bond in the 1990s, where the findings from a number of individual Asch-type studies were statistically combined and analyzed. Looking at this table, you can see that the mean conformity rate for studies done in most of those countries in the 1960s and 1980s was between about 25 and 35%. with the Zimbabwean one being a significant outlier. This table also shows some of Smith and Bond's analyses. Notice how Indian teachers in Fiji have a much higher conformity rate than indigenous Fijian teachers do in their own country. The researchers suggested that this is because Indians in Fiji are a minority group, and when you're part of a minority, your success and security often depend more on getting along with others and fitting in. So the more your life and future are tied up with other people, the more likely you are to go along with the group. And then look at Japan, 51% for the mean rate of conformity amongst a group of club members. That's quite high compared with most other groups. The probable reason is that Japan is a collectivist society, meaning that people are socialized to prioritize group harmony, loyalty, and cohesion over individual opinion. Conforming maintains that harmony. In fact, in the 133 studies that Bond and Smith reviewed, they found more conformity in collectivist cultures than in individualistic ones. Now, I'd like to look at a study done by Todd Lucas et al. In 2006 on conformity with easy versus hard maths problems. The aim was to investigate whether people are more likely to conform when tasks are more difficult. Participants were given maths problems of two types: easy problems with clear, straightforward answers, and hard problems that were more challenging and with less certain answers. They were placed in groups that included Confederates who deliberately gave wrong answers, and researchers measured how often participants conformed to the incorrect group answers. They found that there was higher conformity on the hard problems. That's where we say there's higher ambiguity compared to the easy ones. And this suggests that when people feel less confident in their own judgment, they're more likely to go along with the majority. And it supports the idea of informational social influence. That is, people conform because they believe others may know better, especially when the correct answer is uncertain. So, to sum up what we've looked at in this video, looking at Asch's research and some of the many replications and variations since, we can conclude that conformity is real, but it depends on context. People do conform to group pressure, even when the group is clearly wrong. However, the level of conformity is not fixed. It varies with culture, time period, and situational factors. In the original Asch experiments in 1950s USA, about a third of participants conformed to the majority, showing strong pressure to go along with the group. But rates are generally lower in modern Western individualist societies, whereas they're higher in collectivist cultures, for example, Japan. Overall, we can conclude that people are influenced by group pressure, but they're not completely obedient to it. Many resist, and cultural/social context shapes how strong the effect is.